The EugeneJ.McCarthy lecture series is subtitled Conscience and Courage in Public Life. President Santos took extraordinary risks, both to his political future and legacy, in his decision to broker a peace deal with the FARC. Yet through this decision, he ended a 5-decade civil war that had left hundreds of thousands dead and millions displaced, allowing for a new generation of Colombians to experience peace in their country. Beyond doubt, President Santos has exhibited conscience and courage in public life and is more than a fitting choice for this lecture series. His Excellency Juan Manuel Santos was the President of Colombia from 2010 to 2018. Prior to his election to the highest position in Colombian politics, he held positions such as Minister of Foreign Trade, Minister of National Defense, Minister and Minister of Finance and Public Credit. He also founded the Good Government Foundation and worked as a columnist and deputy director for El Tiempo newspaper of Colombia, earning the King of Spain Prize for outstanding journalism. President Santos has long been recognized as one of the most influential leaders in Latin America and the wider world. Among a host of other international awards and decorations, he has been honored as one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people and was the sole recipient of the 2016 Nobel Peace Prize. During his tenure as president, Colombia enjoyed sustained economic growth, vast reductions in extreme poverty, including a 50% decrease in housing deficits, and creation of the largest infrastructure plan in the history of Colombia. His leadership also extended to the international realm through his work creating the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and entering Colombia into the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Most recently, President Santos served as an Angelopoulos Global Public Leaders Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and was a visiting professor at Oxford University. Clearly, both good warm-ups for his visit to St. Ben's and St. John's tonight. Tonight, in addition to President Santos, we also welcome Valentin Sierra, a fellow Colombian looking to make his mark as a public servant with deep roots to both central Minnesota and St. John's University. Mr. Sierra is a native of Manizales, Colombia, and received most of his primary education there. However, in his senior year, Mr. Sierra participated in an exchange program and attended Cathedral High School here in central Minnesota. After delivering an impassioned speech to his senior class, a number of beneficiaries at the school took notice, and eventually he was offered a scholarship to attend St. John's for his undergraduate education. Since then, Mr. Sierra has worked and worked and worked his way to the top. While here, he served as one of the first student coordinators of the McCarthy Center, while also leading CSB-SJU's International Affairs Society and Model United Nations team. Graduating with a degree in economics and political science, he was the first CSB-SJU international student to earn academic distinction in Phi Beta Kappa. Sierra recently earned a Master of Public Policy degree at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and a master's degree in International Economics and Finance from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. While at the Kennedy School of Government, he was a fellow at the Harvard Graduate School Leadership Institute and served as president of the Harvard Columbian Student Society. He is the Secretary of Planning currently for the Department of Caldas, Colombia. Reflecting on what it means for these two extraordinary leaders to be here tonight, I am continuously brought back to my experience in December attending the 2019 United Nations Climate Change Conference in Madrid, Spain. Along with 18 or so fellow students, we used this opportunity to conduct research on a topic of choice, mine being the intersections of climate change and health, especially for vulnerable populations such as children. What I witnessed at the conference will be a sea change for my worldview moving forward. The sheer number of different nations coming together to combat the common threat to humanity that is climate change was jaw-dropping. Diplomats, scientists, and activists from all around the world could be seen walking the halls of the conference. The world really did feel smaller, with hundreds of nations working together towards a common goal. However, I also witnessed the activism of people that felt like their voices were not being heard. Climate change will affect everyone, rich and poor, black and white. It is vital that all cultures and perspectives are included as we respond to this growing threat. Going to the conference allowed me to both see and hear the result when this doesn't happen at the level it needs to. Though much uncertainty remains regarding humanity's response to climate change, politicians and leaders should pay attention to the conscience and courage demonstrated by President Santos. An effective and decisive response, indeed, will take both. Though shrinking back and relying upon the status quo may seem easier and politically more viable at the time, lasting change doesn't come from those without the courage to stand up alone and make something happen. Let us be the generation that makes something happen, and let us be the generation remembered for what we did do rather than what we failed to do. And now, please welcome His Excellency President Juan Manuel Santos to deliver the 13th Annual Eugene.McCarthy Lecture.
Good evening to all. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much for this generous reception. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I want to distinguish Dr. Matt Lindstrom, the director of the Eugene.McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement. I also want to distinguish the family of former Senator McCarthy, Valentin Sierra, who's going to be the moderator, my compatriot, comes from the heart of the coffee region in Colombia, best coffee in the world. And I want to say, dear students and ladies and gentlemen, a wise man said sometime, being in politics is like being a football coach. You have to be smart enough to understand the game and dumb enough to think it's important. That was Senator McCarthy. And talking about football, we just came this morning from Kansas, where we were celebrating the Super Bowl. And we said to the Kansans, I studied in the University of Kansas, that we made a big effort in Colombia to make the Super Bowl a bit more exciting. So we included Shakira in the halftime. And something that very few people know, the first time I went to the White House during the Obama administration, he gave me, as an entrance in the luncheon, an avocado. And I asked, Mr. President, where is this avocado from? And he said, I don't know, I'll ask. It was from Mexico. And I said, why don't you have Colombian avocados? We produce very delicious avocados. And he started to call his Secretary of Agriculture, and he said, I'm sorry, your avocados are not permitted because of some kind of phytosanitary regulation. And so we made an effort to, before we leave office, to have Colombian avocados in the American supermarkets. We started struggling with our bureaucracies. They were very stubborn, I don't know why, but finally we were able to open the market for the Colombian avocados. And Colombia has an advantage over the other two big suppliers of avocados to the United States, which are Mexico and Chile. We have 3 crops a year. So we are gaining market share. But in the Super Bowl, there's a tradition of eating a lot of avocados, and all the avocados in this Super Bowl were Colombian. So, football players, politicians, everybody wants to be successful, they want to win. So, I would like to share with you what I believe to be the most beautiful definition of what is success. It's a definition from Ralph Waldo Emerson, and it goes like this. What is success? To laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children, to earn the appreciation of honest critics and endure the betrayal of false friends, to appreciate beauty, to find the best in others, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition. To know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. That is to have succeeded. And I've been trying to achieve this kind of success during my whole life. And what I want to do tonight is to share with you a couple of examples in the pursuit of peace and in the fight against poverty, and how we were able to advance in both directions. I start with peace. Peace is the most sublime objective of any society. Every religion has peace as its sort of core. In your behavior, you need to be at peace with yourself, peace with others, and it has to be constructed. Peace doesn't just spontaneously grow. You have to construct it. You make peace with your enemies, not with your friends. This is very important to understand. And in every peace process, there are 2 phases. The first phase is peacemaking. The second phase is peace building. And as you saw in the documentary, I was born in a country at war. And we have had war during my whole lifetime. And I had 2 experiences that in a way defined my life. The first experience was in the Navy, when I arrived as a recruit, a cadet, and an officer said, Santos, get the sailboat and learn how to sail. And I started to learn how to sail. I had no idea what to do. I was in real trouble. And then he said to me, and this was very important for me, and it's very important for any of you. He said, listen, I'm going to teach you something. A good sailor, in order to sail, you need to know where you want to go. And he identified, it was a small bay, identified, you need to go there and you can use all the winds to get there, even if there are winds against you. but you need to know where you want to go. And you have to have this is the title of the documentary, A Port of Destiny. And that is applicable to your own life, your enterprises, a government, a country. And the second experience that marked my life was a dual experience. I had just been appointed Minister of Foreign Trade, the first Minister of Foreign Trade in my country. We used to have a very closed economy. We opened the economy, and I was appointed a minister, and so I had to bring investment. And I went to New York with 2 other ministers, and we organized a conference to sell our country, to attract investment. In the middle of the conference, a bomb exploded in Bogota, huge bomb in a commercial center. Of course, the news came immediately, and the conference simply failed. And the CEO, important CEO, came to me and said, "Listen, Minister, what your story is a beautiful story, and it's coherent, and it has a lot of strength, but you will never have important investments in Colombia unless you finish that war." And that struck me. And by coincidence, some months later, I had to go to South Africa to give the chair of something called the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development, the UNCTAD. I was chairing that conference, and Mandela was elected to chair the following conference. So I had to go to Johannesburg to give the chair to Mandela. We had programmed a 15-minute meeting in the afternoon. That morning, I turned on the television and I saw the most bizarre real-life program. The victims and the perpetrators in real life on television were meeting, and some of them shouted to each other, others embraced each other, and I thought, what is happening? And I asked Mandela, what is it that you're doing here? And he said, we are healing the wounds of a very long war. And we started talking, and these 15 minutes became almost 5 hours of conversations. And at the end, he said to me, you have a beautiful country, but it will never take off if you don't make peace, if you don't finish that war. So in that moment, it sort of clicked, and I chose my destiny, and I'm going to try to finish this war. All my predecessors had tried and failed. And so what I did was to study history. And this is a very important lesson also. Study history, examples of what has happened in other places. It's very useful. And I studied almost all the other peace processes. What was applicable to our peace process, what succeeded, what failed, and the peace processes of my predecessors, why had they failed? And I started identifying the necessary conditions for a successful peace process. There were 3. You need the military balance of power in your favor, in the favor of the state, because as long as the guerrillas think that they can win through violence, they will never negotiate in good faith. Second condition, you need the commanders of the guerrillas to be convinced that they personally are making a good transaction by negotiating peace instead of continuing the war in their personal lives, in their day-to-day lives. And a third condition that is applicable to all what they call asymmetrical wars today in this world, be it in Afghanistan or in Syria or in Colombia, is that you need the support of the region, of your neighbors, in order to have a successful peace process. So I identified those three conditions, and I started to create those conditions to work for them. One of the things that, fortunately, I was able to do was create a new political party called the U Party that in the year 2006 made history because we, for the first time in 157 years, defeated the two traditional parties, the liberals and conservatives, in the legislative elections. And we had a majority. And because of that majority, the then president, asked me, what ministry are you interested in? And I said, the Ministry of Defense. He said, really? Okay, you have it. And there, I then started to make a complete re-engineering of the armed forces, but especially of the intelligence. I went to a friend of mine. He was Prime Minister of Great Britain at that time, Tony Blair, and asked him, Prime Minister, I need your help. He said, how can I help you? I said, you can help me with what you, the British, are the best in the world, intelligence, MI6, James Bond. And he said, okay, and I took virtually a crash course in intelligence that lasted 3 days in a building that had no address. That was where MI6 was. But I also asked the CIA, the Mossad, and we really changed completely the intelligence, which was fundamental to tip the balance of power in our favor. Because with good intelligence, you can be much more effective in the military camp. And we had a strategic advantage because we started to have to use the air, helicopters and planes. And that was a tipping point. And we started through using technology, very small chips that we were able to put in the shoes or in the clothes of the commanders. And those small chips send a signal to the airplanes and the helicopters to go after them. So they started to think, my God, I am a high-value target. I'm in danger. They had been sort of warlords for 40 years with nobody touching them. For the first time, we touched them. But at the same time, the most important asset that any army can have, especially if you're at war, is your legitimacy. And we started making a cultural revolution in our armed forces, telling the soldiers, win the hearts of the people. They will become your allies. They will give you information. They will protect you. And that's the way you win a guerrilla warfare. And I remember a very wise general, he had retired, he was a friend of my father, that went to me and said, I know that you chose the Ministry of Defense because you ultimately want peace. And I'll give you an advice. Treat the FARC, the guerrillas, the oldest and most powerful guerrilla movement in the Western Hemisphere. Treat them not as your enemies, but as your adversaries. And I said, and what's the difference? And he said, oh, there's a great difference. Enemies, you destroy. Adversaries, you beat. And these are human beings, these are Colombians. And if you want eventually to make peace with them, you need to understand that they're human beings and respect even their human rights. And that was a very, very important lesson that I applied and helped a lot in the negotiation. So I became very successful Minister of Defense, and I got elected president with the highest amount of votes and the highest margin ever in the Colombian history. I knew that I needed the third condition, because the first and second condition were more or less fulfilled when I was Minister of Defense, but the third condition was the condition to rally the support, to get the support of my neighbors, with whom we had a very bad situation. We had no diplomatic or commercial relations with Venezuela or with Ecuador, tremendous hostility with Brazil and Peru. And I remembered an experience that an American president, Ronald Reagan, had with Gorbachev. He went and told Gorbachev in Geneva, "Listen, Mr. Gorbachev, I will never become a communist, and you will never become a capitalist. Let's have that clear. But you and I can work for a superior motive that will benefit you, me, and mankind. And that is, let's commit ourselves to decrease the nuclear arsenal." And they did it. So I said to then President Chavez, who hated me, we were very, very acid enemies. I said, let's get together, and I told him about Reagan and Gorbachev and said, listen, I will never become a Bolivarian revolutionary, and you will never become a liberal Democrat. Let's not discuss about that, but we can work together for something that will benefit you, the Venezuelans and the Colombians, peace with the FARC. And he said, are you serious? And said, yes, I am. And we shook hands. And I did the same thing with our neighbor in the south, with the president of Ecuador, who did not like me very much because I had bombed a camp of the FARC in Ecuadorian territory. So you can imagine that I was not in his heart. But he understood the situation, and so I had the three conditions ready to start a peace process. And a very wise gentleman, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, Shlomo Ben-Ami, he was one of the architects of Camp David, the Camp David Agreement. I met him many times before, but he went to visit me and said, you know that you could continue making war and continue with your tremendous popularity. I was over 80% in the polls. If you decide to sit with the FARC and negotiate, your popularity will come down immediately. And it might even cost you your life, as happened to Isaac Rabin in Israel when he made or tried to make peace with Arafat. His own people said, you're a traitor, and they killed him. And you're going to feel the same. Your own people will say, you're a traitor because you were elected, because you were a hawk. And suddenly, you become a dove, and people will not understand that. But it's the only way you can end the war. So I remember this Churchillian phrase that said, do the right thing, however difficult or unpopular it may be. And I announced the peace process in my inauguration speech. I needed something else. Since my popularity was going to come down, I needed the support of the Congress. In government, when you are a president or head of a government, the ideal situation is to be very popular and to have a majority in Congress. That's ideal. You can govern being very popular and not having a majority in Congress, or you can govern having a majority in Congress and not being very popular. You can still govern. What is really very difficult to handle is when you don't have a popular support and you don't have the majority in Congress, then you're in trouble. So I said, if my popularity is going to go down, I need a majority in Congress. So I remembered what Abraham Lincoln did in order to get the majority in Congress to abolish slavery. He invited his former rivals in the elections to become part of the cabinet. And I did exactly the same. My former adversaries in the election, I talked to each of them and said, listen, that part of your program, I will invite you to become part of my government, and let's put it in motion. And so I got a huge majority, 80% majority in Congress. And we started the negotiations very, first the secret, there were 2 years of secret negotiations of the agenda, then an open negotiations in Oslo, they were announced. It's always very difficult to negotiate and fight at the same time. But that was another lesson that I took from precisely Isaac Rabin. He said to Arafat, I will negotiate with you, with terrorism, as if there is no terrorism. But I will continue to fight terrorism as if there is no peace dialogue. So you separated the two completely. It's very difficult to do because you're sitting down with a group of people who are slaughtering your compatriots, blowing up towns, and so people say, why are you sitting with this guy who's doing those terrible things? But since we had the balance of power in our favor, it was a way to press them for a more rapid solution of the war. And in the long run, it was like that. They felt the pressure. We were very successful. I had to take very difficult decisions. Just a few months after I was inaugurated, I had already started indirect communications with the #1 of the FARC, the commander of the FARC. And suddenly, the head of the army came to me, called me and said, we have, his name was Cano, Mr. Cano, localized. I know where he is. What are your orders? And that's one of the moments that you feel alone. They say that when you're in power, the loneliness of the power. I thought, if I go after him, the peace process will probably collapse. But if I don't, my military, who I needed as allies, this is one new ingredient, I brought the military in the negotiations, will then become spoilers. And my predecessors have failed because they were spoilers, the military were spoilers. And I remembered the rules of the game that we put with the FARC, because I told them, we will continue the war until we reach an agreement. And you can kill me, and I told them with those words, and vice versa. And they said yes. And so I said, these are the rules of the game, and I authorized the operation, and he was taken down. Afterwards, when we sang the peace process, the other commander said, we hated you for doing that, but we respected you more. We never thought you would be able to do that. And in the long run, that helped us believe more in you. It's a paradox. It's an irony, but that happened. Anyway, my popularity went down, and I had another experience. You saw in the documentary some of the victims, 2, I believe, and that was an exercise that a professor of leadership in Harvard, Ronald Heifetz, told me at the beginning of the process. You're going to feel discouraged. Many times you're going to sort of want to throw in the towel. You need something to re-energize you, to tell your soul and your heart to continue. Talk to the victims. They will re-energize you. And I started talking to the victims, asking them their lives, why were they victims? And I remember one that really struck me. This lady, her name is Pastora Mira. Her father had been killed 10 years before. Her husband had been killed. Her brother had been killed. And suddenly, her son was tortured and killed. And this lady was devastated. And a week later, after his son was killed, somebody came into her house asking for help. That person was wounded. And she took this person and put him in the bed of his son, of his late son. And she cured him. And when he was going out, he saw a photograph of this lady and her son. And he said, he was sort of shocked. He said, "Is that your son?" And she said, "That was my son, yes." And he said, "I'm sorry, but I have to say, I have to tell you, I was the one who tortured and killed your son." And this lady looked at him, and then she embraced him and said, "Thank you." And this guy was shocked. Why do you thank me? And she said something beautiful. She said, "I thank you because by you telling me that you were the one who did it, and you're, in a way, asking for forgiveness, you will liberate me from hating for the rest of my life. You will liberate me from hating for the rest of my life." That was a very powerful story, and for me, the victims gave me a lesson in life. I thought that in order to get peace, you need something you need a different kind of justice. It's called transitional justice. That's a justice that was negotiated in an international treaty, the Statute of Rome. And it's a justice that is different from the ones we are accustomed to. The sanctions are not sending you to jail, but sending you to repair the victims. And that means that many of the perpetrators will not go to a normal jail. And that, for many people, is unacceptable. And I thought that the ones who were going to be the most vehement in opposing transitional justice were going to be the victims, precisely because they were victims. And I discovered that it was a different, completely different. They were the most generous. And I asked them, why are you so generous? They said, because we've suffered so much. We don't want other people to suffer what we suffered. That was, for me, a tremendous lesson in life and gave me the energy to continue. And we finally signed the agreement. What is called the DDR, demobilization, disarmament, reintegration, was made in record time. And I had promised the people that I would put the agreement to a referendum. You saw that in the documentary. I lost the referendum. Why did I lose the referendum? Two reasons. Climate change. The hurricanes usually go around Colombia and hit the Caribbean islands and maybe Mexico. The day of the vote, the hurricane hit Colombia, the north coast, the Caribbean coast, and we lost over 2.5 million votes. And we lost the referendum only by 50,000. And the second reason is something that is becoming too popular. You are familiar with fake news. The process was a victim of fake news since the beginning. They even said, this is a university, Benedictine congregation is the one that runs this university. I went to a school that was run by the Benedictines, and the priest who was the head of the school, Father Francis, he was accused by some of the enemies of the process. He said, Father Francis was a disguised communist, and he was the one who convinced Santos, since he was in school, to become a communist. And this peace agreement is going to give to the communists the country. Those are the type of fake news. They were so ridiculous that I didn't even pay any attention. But they were repeated and repeated and repeated, and suddenly people started to believe, and they voted no. Anyway, what did I do? I called the leaders of the no vote, renegotiated the agreement, and put it again, not to a referendum because I was prohibited by law, by the Constitutional Court, but to Congress. It was accepted. But of course, something happened in the meantime. I was one day, 4 o'clock in the morning, sleeping. The phone rang, and it was my son. You won the Nobel Peace Prize. I said, thank you, and I hung up and I continued to sleep. But that was very important because the Colombians, in a way, understood that as a support from the international community to continue the process. And we then ended the first phase, the peacemaking, and we started the second phase, the peace building. Pope Francis had been a good ally And I used to go to the Vatican and speak to him. And many times I said, he always encouraged me to continue. And he always made mentions about the peace process in Colombia and his different visits around the world. And I said, Pope Francis, it's very difficult. Why don't you go to Colombia and give me a hand? And he said, President Santos, I pray a lot for you. And I said, if the Pope has to pray a lot for me, it means I'm in deep trouble. No? And he said, no, continue. I will go when you will most need me and when the Colombians will most need me. And he chose to go after the guerrillas had given up their arms to the United Nations, and he himself put the title of his visit. I go to Colombia to push the Colombians in towards taking the first step towards reconciliation, because he knew that was the most difficult phase. Reconciliation and making peace is much easier, is much more difficult, than making war. Reconciliation and making peace, you need to persuade. You need to convince people to forgive. That's very difficult many times. Making war, the type of leadership is very vertical and quite easy. You rally the forces around you. Those are the bad guys, we are the good guys, let's go. And as long as you win, you become very popular. Making peace is completely different. And it takes perseverance. And it takes a lot of conviction to change the hearts and the minds of the people. But Pope Francis said, you must continue. It's going to be a long journey, and that's the journey we're in right now, in the process of reconciliation. Parallel to this, and I'll be very short on the second subject, was we needed to create the conditions, what they call the objective conditions for peace. And one of the reasons for the war, at least what the guerrillas always claimed, was the social injustice, the tremendous inequality in Colombia. And so, parallel to the peace process, we started a very audacious program to fight poverty. I had a professor at the London School of Economics and at Harvard. He came from India. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics. His name is Amartya Sen. And he was very critical of the traditional way of measuring poverty. The World Bank, the IMF, measuring poverty for how much you earn. And if you earn more than $1.50 or $2 or $3, then you're poor, you're not poor. He said, this is nonsense. What you should try to achieve is that the basic necessities of the families are fulfilled for them to have a dignified life. So when I got elected and I started the peace process, I called him. And I said, Professor Sen, this is your former student. And he said, no, I know who you are. I want your help. And I went to Oxford. And he had a complete team of his people. They went back to Colombia, and we were the first country to start applying his methodology. We needed to approve a law, but since I had 80% of the Congress, that was not difficult. The budget, and it started to work beautifully, and it helped tremendously to focus the social investment where the impact on poverty was going to be the greatest. So it was a good government measure, and the poverty started to go down, and I can say, and I don't say it, the international organizations say that Colombia in the last 8-9 years has been the country that in relative terms have brought down more poverty and extreme poverty than any country in Latin America. And we have to continue because we still have too many poor people, but we used to have many, many more. We brought out of poverty almost 5.5 million Colombians. So this is the story I wanted to share with you. We also had something, but I don't, maybe in the question and answers I can address that. Reconciliation also with the environment. And that was something that Pope Francis stressed a lot, and something that I was convinced that I had to do because I was also a victim of climate change, me and my country, at the beginning of the government. And so we made a very aggressive policy, put a carbon tax, and protected more than 43 million hectares of rainforest and marine ecology for Colombia to be on the forefront of the protection of our biodiversity. I will end with some simple lessons that I learned and that I want to share with the students here. As I said, what I learned in the Navy, know where you want to go. It's very important. Otherwise, you will never get there. Second, do what is right, no matter if it's unpopular. You have to learn how to swim against the current. Sometimes it makes you even stronger. Third, very important, develop empathy. What do I mean by empathy? I say this is the most important virtue of any leader, to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the people you're leading or in the shoes of the people you're negotiating with, to understand their feelings, their fears, their hopes. Then you can establish a much richer dialogue and lead with much more effectiveness. Empathy. Don't forget that word in business or in whatever activity. Be bold. Be ambitious. If you're not ambitious, if you don't put your aim high, then your progress will not be as high as you would have liked. And something that is also very important. It's always better to feel sorry for what you did. Don't get to the end of your life feeling sorry for what you could have done and didn't. Today, if I look back and I say, how many people, the big majority of the people, and many of my ministers and many of the politicians and many of the journalists at that time told me, don't be stupid. Why are you going to go into this very difficult path of, again, trying to negotiate peace with these people? See what happened to your predecessors. They all failed. You're going to be another failed president. If I had heard them and acted accordingly, I couldn't be here standing in front of you saying, I'm sorry I didn't do it. So don't feel sorry for what you have not done. And that is what I learned, and that is what I wanted to share with you today. and I hope this will add something to the lives and the future of all of you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Valentin Sierra, Valentin Sierra en español. When I was in Minnesota, I had to adapt a little bit to the environment. And it is a huge honor to welcome Juan Manuel Santos to campus today, to the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. Mr. President, it is quite an honor to be sitting here with you, and thank you for taking interest in this initiative over a year ago, and for believing in the legacy of EugeneJ.McCarthy and in this project. This is a very special project at St. John's University, the Eugene J. McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement. Thank you. And Mr. President, you forgot to mention one thing about avocados. The best avocados are Colombian avocados, but the best of the best, top of the line, are Caldas avocados.
That's good, yeah.
And Mr. President, speaking of climate change and the issues that you have sought to tackle globally, you have demonstrated your capacity not only to lead in Colombia and to bring up peaceful resolution to our multiple decade conflict, but you have also shown leadership in the world stage. Tell us that story of how the Sustainable Development Goals came into being. Tell us that story of how you were a pioneer and the architect of the Sustainable Development Goals and the responsibility that developing countries also have on this front.
Well, when I was Minister of Defense, I went to the top of the highest mountain in the world that is near the coast. It's called the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. And you have the oldest and purest indigenous communities living there, 4 different communities. And I went there, a friend of mine introduced me to them, and I had a marvelous conversation. Their way of looking at things, their concept of justice and concept of nature. And they are our older brothers. We are their younger brothers. And so the day of my inauguration, I went to them. I took a plane, about an hour from Bogota, and went up in a helicopter and asked for their permission to go to Congress and be inaugurated. And they were very thrilled, and they gave me a stick, bastón de mando, a stick, power stick. And they said to me, President, we will give you our approval for you to go to Congress. Thank you for this gesture. No president had ever done that. And we ask you to make peace, but not only make peace among humans, make peace with nature. Nature is mad. She's been mistreated. And you are going to suffer, unfortunately, the consequences of that. And I was, okay, I was surprised. I took the power stick with me. A week later, the worst Niña phenomenon hit Colombia, and the first year and a half, I had to administer the floodings of half of the country. And I remember that. I remember Al Gore went to Colombia because I summoned the people. What can we do with this situation? I created the new Ministry of the Environment. Al Gore gave me a lesson in climate change, a marvelous lesson, and I got very much enthusiastic about protecting our biodiversity. Colombia is the richest country in the world in terms of biodiversity per square kilometer. We have the highest concentration of biodiversity in the whole world. And I was in this process, and two young, marvelous women that worked with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs went to my office and said, Mr. President, we have a proposal for you to take the leadership of something that is going to, it could be very, very important for the world. And I said, what is it? And he said, the Millennium Goals end in 2015. They have to be renewed, but they have to be renewed with a different optic, a different approach. The developed countries should also be responsible. And you need the environmental ingredient. And I said, sounds like a good idea. You know that I only read memos that are maximum 3 pages long. And they said, we know, Mr. President, and they gave you a memo. And they were the proposal for the Sustainable Development Goals. And I talked to my Minister of Foreign Affairs and said, this is a good idea, and you need to have a critical mass. Why don't you go and convince some countries, and we will table this proposition in the Rio +20 summit. That was the year 2012. And I went personally to the summit and made the proposal. I remember the Chinese were chairing the meeting. The Chinese minister came down and said, Mr. President, you come from a small country. And I said, it's not that small, but you have a big idea. China will support it. And the British Prime Minister, then was David Cameron, said, my God, what a great idea. We will support it. And then we started to negotiate how many Sustainable Development Goals and which Sustainable Development Goals. It was a multilateral, fascinating negotiation. We ended up with the 17 that you all know about, and that became the world agenda in the year 2015 by an unanimous decision of the General Assembly of the United Nations. When I was ending the government, I went back to this indigenous community because they had said, when you finish your term, you have to give us back our power stick. And so I went and I had sent them the proposal of the SDGs. And they said, we studied what you proposed and what the world has adopted, but there's something lacking, something very important. And I said, and what is that? And they said, the spiritual component. You need the spiritual component for the human race to respect nature. And you need the spiritual component to understand that the rivers have life, and that the trees have life, and that they're all interconnected. And I thought it was so powerful. And then they gave me the stick back and said, you need to continue fighting for Mother Nature 4 more years. And so I have my stick in my house, and I am going around the world talking about climate change because I do believe that is the most important challenge that the world has. Senator Eugene.McCarthy was a great politician, and he didn't like wars, as I don't like wars. And he was very enthusiastic about the lowering the nuclear arsenal. The the planet since World War II, the most dangerous phenomena, what we fear, is a nuclear proliferation, nuclear war. And we still have the probability of a nuclear war, but it's still only a probability. We have a certainty with climate change, and the effects of climate change will be as devastating as a nuclear war if we don't act now and if we don't act accordingly. So this is something that I want to leave with you, because the more I study, the more I go around the world, the more convinced I am of the necessity to act on this front.
Thus, the need to establish more partnerships, and for instance, the academic partnership between Colombia and the people and academic community of Minnesota in order to foment research in this area of climate change is so important. Mr. President, your book, The Battle for Peace, was the best-selling book in Colombia last year. It's now on its 5th edition. It's yet to be translated into English, but that edition is coming as well to Minnesota and elsewhere. Tell us, what was your purpose in writing this book and what the next one will be about?
Well, I am a great reader of biographies, as you probably have noticed. And one of the persons I admire the most has been Winston Churchill. And he used to say, I have to write my history, otherwise other people will write it for me and I probably won't like it. This peace process was, when I explained to you about the fake news and was so bombarded by all kinds of lies, that I thought it would be good to set the record straight rather soon. And so I wrote this book, but also I included some lessons for conflict resolutions, some basic lessons that I mentioned there that could be applicable to almost every conflict. I am absolutely convinced that all conflicts can be resolved through dialogue, goodwill, through empathy, understanding the people that think different from you. There's always room for a transaction. Politics have been always, the art of politics is the art of making good transactions. What we're seeing in today's world is that you are leaving transactions to one side and winner takes all. And that is the recipe for failure of a democracy. You need to be able to make transactions by which you can create synergies. Everybody will be better off. When Reagan and Gorbachev sat down and said, let's do this, let's transact this and that, everybody was better off. The mankind was better off. We urgently need that type of third way. I wrote a book with Tony Blair called The Third Way. And I think that today this is needed urgently to find common denominators, build bridges, because what the world is seeing is that you're separating, the polarization is feeding radicalism, false nationalism, and also feeding hate. And this is bad for the world and for everybody.
Mr. President, speaking of the role of government and your thoughts on what government could be doing better. At the beginning of 2010, at the beginning of your administration, you mentioned that it was very important to make it very clear what was going to be your rationale for the next 4 years, and then for your second administration as well. And you mentioned that it was important to have as much market as possible and as much state as necessary, as much government as necessary. How has your view on the role of government evolved since then, and has that rationale been updated in any way?
Well, this is not my phrase. This is a phrase of a sociologist who used to be the head of the London School of Economics, who invented the third way. I took that phrase from him, Professor Giddens.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a very pragmatic approach, but very, I think, very effective. You allow the markets to operate as much as possible, but you intervene when the markets don't operate well, and you intervene when it's necessary. Different countries have different conditions, so different degrees of intervention. But the people who have applied this third way, in some way or another, you analyze the history of those countries, and the maximum prosperity in these countries have occurred during the mandate of the people who have applied the third way. Here in the United States, you make a historic comparison. Clinton had a tremendous creation of prosperity. Tony Blair in the UK, Schroeder in Germany, Felipe González in Spain, Ricardo Lagos in Chile, Fernando Enrique Cardoso in Brazil. And I think that today, to recuperate this concept of a third way could help us find this new democracy that everybody's wanting to apply, and new economic policies, much more inclusive economic policies, to avoid all these protests that you're seeing around the world.
Mr. President, we also got a lot of questions from the students who want to know about your personal life as a leader, as an academic, and we know that you have recently become a grandfather. Are you happy right now in your current role as former President of Colombia, and what's next for you?
Am I happy? I'm thrilled. Some people ask me, what is it that you sort of feel that you lost when you finished your term? And I said, almost nothing. If the people give you the opportunity to lead them, you do as much as it is possible. And when you do as much as it is possible, you feel at ease with yourself. Always, this is to every leader. If you look back, you feel sorry that you couldn't do more. There's always much more that you could have done. But if you did what humanly was possible, then you have peace of mind. And you have to learn that power comes and goes. I have hated, and I'm sorry to use that word, but I think that the damage that what they call the caudillos have made to the countries where they have operated. And in caudillo is a Stalin, a caudillo is Mussolini, caudillo is Hitler, and caudillos in Latin America you have plenty, that only live out of power, and they think that they are the saviors of their countries or of mankind. And they disregard what I think is the most important thing for any democracy, that are the institutions. And that's why I made a constitutional reform in Colombia prohibiting re-election. That will strengthen our institutions. And it is the institutions, however imperfect they are, and as Churchill used to say, democracy is the worst of all systems, excluding the others. However imperfect they are, we don't have a better system, but we have to make our institutions work. You here in the United States are going through a crisis of the institutions. In Colombia, in France, in Spain, almost everywhere in the world, we're seeking to reinvent democracy, a more inclusive democracy, a more inclusive economy. People feel frustrated, the young people feel threatened, feel uncertain. The technological progress has created a fear of what is going to happen with my job tomorrow. Artificial intelligence and all this progress is creating tremendous uncertainties that the political system has to be able to sort of adapt in order to be able to lead. One of the definitions of intelligence that I like the most is the capacity to adapt to new circumstances. And we need that urgently in today's world. But going back to, if I'm happy, yes, my granddaughter, 1.5 years old, she's starting to say my name, and that is much more fulfilling than 8.5 million votes. So, so I have a new life. I had always wanted, and this is something that I think you were there. I went to Harvard as a in a fellowship and a visiting professor, and they said, how should we address you as Mr. President, Nobel laureate? Or I said, I had always dreamed of somebody saying, "Hello, Professor Santos." And I think this is the most extraordinary career that you can have, or activity, being professor and sharing the little knowledge you have with other people. And I'm very happy sharing my knowledge with other people.
Well, Professor Santos, this has been a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for being in Collegeville with us and for sharing 2 days, 2 full days with this amazing community. I was going to invite you sailing, but the 10,000 lakes in Minnesota are frozen. Do you like ice skating? We could go tomorrow. And thank you, Professor Matt Lindstrom, for the invitation. Thank you, St. John's University, College of St. Benedict. And please let's stand up to give a round of applause to Juan Manuel Santos, Nobel Peace Prize laureate.